Okay, hello, welcome back. I'm Karen and I'm here with Kelly. Today we are answering more of your grief questions. This is a question about support. And the question is, what should I expect from a grief group?
Yes. So I personally love grief groups. If I could just do grief groups all day, I would. I think they're so beneficial and there's so many benefits that come out of it. And I understand, I'm going to preface, I know not everybody feels the same way I do. And people feel nervous about coming to a grief group, about being vulnerable in front of a group of strangers. And some people do obviously prefer more individual coaching or counseling. But for those of you that are maybe considering joining a grief group, I want to kind of talk about different kinds. So, obviously, there is peer led grief groups, and this means there's not a coach or a counselor facilitating it. There may not be necessarily a topic, it may just be more open sharing. Which is it can be definitely beneficial and good. Peer-led groups are amazing. But if you are really wanting maybe more tools and strategies to be able to help you in your grief, you might want to look for a group that's facilitated by a grief counselor or a grief coach. And they may be a little more structured. They may have a topic for the session. They may have even homework and assignments, may do different interventions in the group. So you have to kind of first, I think about what you are looking for. I mean, the majority of my clients, when I ask them what their goal is for the group, is that they want to learn new things. They want to learn things to be able to help them. And you may learn that in a peer-led group because of sharing, but maybe not. And so the benefits is I personally believe that being able to hear other people's stories and being able to relate to them is so beneficial in our grief, because when we feel so isolated in our grief, we feel so alone. And as I probably have shared in other videos, when my mom died, I walked into that grief group at the local hospice and I finally felt like I wasn't alone in my grief. And it's probably why I love grief groups now so much, is because it was life changing for me, to be completely honest. And I really felt like I was the only teen who was grieving. And so to be able to see those other girls in that group really, it just made me feel less alone. And, so I think that's a big piece, is to feel less alone. Also to normalize what you're feeling. Karen, how many times they say, well, I'm going to say something and
Oh,
it's
yeah.
probably going to sound a little crazy. And they'll say it and everybody else in the room will be like, oh, me, I've had that
Yeah.
happen too. Right.
Yes.
So it kind of can normalize our feelings, our experiences. I think you can get just as much out of a grief group by listening as you can by sharing. So if you're worried about like having to be vulnerable and share, maybe just go and listen for a couple of sessions. And then, you might feel free to open up a little bit more. I think I've seen a lot of connections being made, especially like my young widows group. They started a Facebook like message, and they'll share with each other, check in with each other around the different, throughout outside of the group during the weeks. So just have that, know somebody else who's going through something similar. Obviously, we all grieve very differently and uniquely, but there is some, similarities. And to be able to have that connection and support, and maybe learn some new tools as well to be able to help you be able to, we're not asking you to get over it, but how can you move forward in your life? What things can you do so you can grow bigger than your grief, right?
Yeah. Yeah,
What
absolutely.
what do you think, Karen?
Well, I think it's really, and I've had that, seen that thing happen. First, I love because I do, at this point, the majority of my groups are going to be on Zoom. I have done them in person for years and years, but in Zoom, you've got everybody like right there in front of you. And I love when one person's talking and you can just see other people doing this. And it's like there's just that understanding and that recognition. And, we go around, people introduce themselves, kind of share their challenges and their stories. Sometimes we're only at like the fourth person and they're like, I already feel better. Like
Yeah,
even just from
exactly.
three people talking, I
Yeah.
already feel so much better. So you're right. I mean, I think it's the validation, I think there's some education, which is really, really important. I talk a lot of times, it's like in terms of our grief, it's like, this is what's happened. This is where I am. Where do I go from here? And people feel very lost. And I think, people will idea share. I mean, I think sometimes people are like, well, I tried this and this has worked for me. And it's not necessarily about giving advice, but like maybe sometimes people are having issues with sleep or they're having challenges with a family member or trying to figure some of that out. And certainly you and I are there to facilitate that. But as I often say, like, you guys are the group. Like that's what makes it work, is what they are doing to support each other and help each other. And you see like amazing connections happen. And I think even if you're someone who does feel like hesitant or shy, understanding that this isn't like your normal sort of like social situations where you have to go in and kind of feel each other out and like, do we have things in common? And,
Yeah.
do we like the same things? Or are they similar person to me? Like when it's like, hey, you've lost your mom, I've lost your mom, let's talk. Like everything else kind of falls away, and these connections are like fast and easy and comfortable. And I do see that a lot of times for
Yeah,
sure.
and I mean, I've worked with some kids that they do not like individual counseling,
Mm,
but they thrive in a grief group
interesting.
because
Yeah.
it makes them feel like they think when they come to individual counseling, something's wrong with them, right? And that they're different. But when they're sitting in a group with other kids, they don't feel different.
Right.
And so they're able to share and be able to be like, "Oh, your dad died too?" Like, just to see the connections and to hear what they talk about amongst themselves, it's just so amazing, and that also obviously happens with the adults as well. And,
Yeah.
I do a pet loss group, and we have a local, at-home euthanasia vet, and he sponsors this group on a monthly basis, and every time, I facilitate this group, it comes out is, "Well, I didn't have the support I needed.
Mm,
I was really struggling, and nobody really wants to hear me talk about my dog anymore." And so being able to come to a space where everybody gets it, and they they're like you said, "I feel so much better already."
yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a big part of it because I mean, we are, even if we count ourselves as an introvert or someone who likes to be, mostly on our own, I mean, we're still social creatures and we are looking for validation from other people. And it can be very, very hard to find in our normal circles,
Yep.
that it's okay to still be sad or be thinking about this stuff. And so I think when people start to talk about some of their different timelines and where they are, I think there's like a lot of relief, that can come with it. And I think in terms of like encouraging a person to get to a group too, I try to remind them, I'm like, listen, just try it.
Exactly.
I mean, really, if you go and don't like it, that's fine. But I think when you're at a point in your life that you've never been, the things that you've had that have worked before may or may not still work, and you may need something different or you may need more.
Absolutely.
And so, what are we talking, hour and a half? Go to a group and see how it goes. And if you don't like it, that's okay. Although actually I have a woman that I work with, and she says, listen, if you don't like it, try and remember that it's because you don't like being there and maybe give it one more time.
Well, exactly. What I
Yeah,
always say is this isn't a group anyone wants to be in,
absolutely.
right? This isn't what we're like, "Oh, I wanna be able to go to a grief group,"
Right.
But if you're in this position, why not try it? I always think the first 2 sessions, especially the close-ended group, may be a little intense because that's when we share a little bit more about our
Yeah.
loved ones and all. And so give it a couple of times because,
Yeah.
it takes a little bit to feel comfortable, to feel vulnerable. And what's interesting, I find, and I don't know if you hear this a lot, Karen, but we always talk about not comparing our grief, right? Everybody's grief is valid and we feel it at 100%. But I do find what happens a lot of times is somebody will go to a grief group and be like, "Wow, I can't believe what she's going through. That has to be so hard." It's like put things into perspective for my loss as
Yes.
well.
Yeah.
And so it's even those kinds of things that can be so beneficial.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I do try to say to people too, because we do have to be mindful of people who are very empathetic,
Mm,
and to be careful not to walk into that group like a
exactly.
sponge and just start absorbing everybody else's stuff. So, and that's where I think, Kelly, like with a professionally led group, we can kind of keep an eye out for some of that stuff
Yeah,
and try
absolutely.
and help people with that. But I do try to say to people like, listen, let's make sure that we don't leave you worse than we found you. Like, let's have you come into this group and then leave feeling, like you got something out of it, but you don't have to take everybody else's stuff home with you
Absolutely. Yeah,
either.
and I do think that's one of the things about a peer-led group can be challenging because if somebody's having a big grief burst and a challenge, the other members may not know how to necessarily navigate that,
Yeah.
and can be really overwhelming and almost traumatic.
Yeah.
So I do think having, where there's a trained facilitator, there's a lot of benefits to that.
Yeah.
Um, And,
Absolutely.
also be mindful of the kind of group you're going to, because there is, both you and I do a lot of niche specific groups, which I think there's also benefits to a general grief group as well. But it is nice to be able to connect with people, especially like I did a substance use loss group.
Mhm.
And some of these women didn't feel comfortable sharing in a regular group, but in that group, they were able to really be vulnerable and honest because everybody in that group got it and they
Yeah.
didn't feel that stigma. And so, and also there are some groups out there that combine different type of losses like divorce with death. And I would advise against those, to be honest.
Mm.
Because I think while you may be able to get certain things from that, I think that's very different kind of grief and loss.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't always think it's best to combine groups like that.
I agree with you. I mean, and they are absolutely both have an intense amount of grief with them. There's no question about it. So
Mhm.
it's not to diminish one or the other, but it's different. And what people want when they go into a grief group is to feel connected.
Mhm.
And I'm glad that you mentioned that about like we both do, some specific group, but sometimes there's groups that are even more specific. And absolutely knowing that there are resources out there, um, just to start like Googling and searching things, or, certainly contact us. We can help find
Yeah.
resources. But I think people would be surprised. But I do think it's important for things like suicide, substance abuse, loss of a child. I mean, I think there are certain things where being in a general grief group could be helpful, but maybe not necessarily quite enough. And
Okay.
so going to that, finding that specific group is, I do think that that's important
Yeah.
for someone to really feel supported. I mean, that's kind of the point of the group,
Yeah,
is to feel
definitely.
really connected.
Yeah, and I mean, Karen, your groups on Grief in Common are open to anyone in the world, right?
Hmm.
I'm a little more limited, because of my clinical license, but my groups are open. I do a lot of my groups hybrid, so in person and virtual in Florida, New York, and South Carolina. But I mean, you are always doing some amazing groups, so I would encourage everybody to check out your website and your groups because I do think there's a lot of value to being part of a grief group.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, and I think, continuing to try and just encourage people to get support in general, and that's really what I talk to people. The more support, the better. I mean, listen, trying different things, seeing what works. Some people are really like into reading books, listening to podcasts,
Mhm.
going to individual support, grief support. I think it's worth trying it all. I really do.
Absolutely.
And if it doesn't stick, that's okay. But like at a time like this, the things that normally are like, well, I've always been a person that read and I always found, self help books, but like maybe you're struggling to read and
Mhm.
maybe like you can't focus and concentrate. So again, more support the better. That's really really important. So, well, thank you, Kelly, and thank you
Thank you.
for answering our question here today. And we'll be back next time. Please make sure to subscribe to our channel so that you can stay up to date with all of our videos, which are coming out twice a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays. So we'll see you at the next one.